Now, the Kremlin says it has not yet made a decision on closing Russia's borders, despite a flood of men leaving to avoid being called up to fight in Ukraine. The mobilization could see as many as 300,000 reservists sent in. Neighbouring Georgia is one of the countries seeing a big influx of Russian men.
Long lines of vehicles at the Larsi border crossing, an entry point to Georgia. These men are fleeing Russia and Vladimir Putin's military mobilization.
We paid $1,200 to be escorted to the point, which is 3 kilometers before the Russian checkpoint, on the Russian-Georgia border. Because if you just honestly stay in the queue, leaving Russia could take at least 72 hours. Paying our fee, we made it in 30 hours.
Russian authorities acknowledged a significant influx of cars trying to cross into Georgia. This comes after an announcement of a partial mobilization sparked an exodus of fighting-age men. And some fear that the situation will get even worse.
I expect martial law to be declared as a result of unification with those eastern parts of Ukraine to Russia, which will be followed by a global mobilization. For me personally, I see neither ideological nor legal grounds for myself to get involved in this war.
A sentiment shared by many in Russia who have protested against Moscow's call-up of military reservists. In the Dagestan region, there were clashes with police. A human rights monitor says over 100 people were arrested. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called on Russians not to submit to mobilization.
We see that people, in particular in Dagestan, began to fight for their lives. We see that they are beginning to understand that this is a question of their lives. Why should their husbands, brothers, sons die in this war? In a war that no one wants. In a war against our people, on our land. He does not send his children to war.
Trying to stop the exodus, Russia toughened penalties for voluntary surrender and refusal to fight. With those who do that now facing up to 10 years in prison. But for many, the alternative is far more intimidating.
Let's get more on this from Nick Connolly in Kiev. Welcome, Nick. How are Ukrainians responding to the news of Russia's military mobilization?
Well, first of all, on social media, there is a lot of interest and kind of surprise at the lack of protests in Russia. You know, if you go beyond that northern Caucasus region where most of the protests have been, people asking, why would Russians leave their country? Why would they wait, days at border points to cross if they could maybe go out in the streets and change something at home? So definitely kind of a lot of quizzical reactions there. As for the kind of the experts in the military kind of high ranks here in Kiev, well, there is worry longer term that Russia will have significantly greater numbers of boots on the ground. That is surely the case, but there's a lot of question and kind of concern that this actually probably will take a lot longer than the Russians are hoping, that actually it'll only really be felt by early next year, after the winter season, where basically it's not expected that the front line will move very much indeed. And then there's also the question of how well these people are being trained and what kind of equipment they've been given. There's lots of photos and video out on social media of rusty AK-47s being handed out, people given uniforms that look like they've been in a store cupboard for the best part of a few decades. So worry in the longer term, but in the short and medium term, not so much of a concern, in the sense that lots of this is more about kind of the politics inside Russia and less about real facts on the ground.
Meanwhile, so-called referendums are being about joining Russia are being held in Ukraine's occupied east. What's being said about them?
I think no one here in Kiev takes them seriously. It's being seen as a bit of political theatre, one where the result was already clear before they were called. This had been on the cards for months, but then was pretty hastily announced and then kind of held a couple of days after the announcement came through. I think the bigger worry is what happens after this. Are we going to see Vladimir Putin then, at the end of this week, as is expected, calling these regions part of Russia, saying now this is all Russia, so if you, Ukraine, try and regain these territories, then you are directly taking Russia and we will threaten you with nuclear weapons. That's the expectation, and that's something that people are definitely taking very seriously. That perspective that Russia in a tight corner with military options kind of being lost day by day, resorting to the kind of ultimate threat there, and definitely kind of potential for greater escalation.
Right. So that's the worry then, that if the vote happens as we all expect it to, that these places join Russia, then that's the big change. Russia is able to notch up this war another couple of gears.
Well, definitely in its own logic. Obviously, no one outside Russia looks set to recognise this. We've even heard from some of Russia's closest allies, like Kazakhstan, saying that they're not going to take this, as anything legitimate. Belarus has not recognised Russia's annexation of Crimea since 2014, so this is definitely something that only really concerns Russia. But in their logic, it would allow them to, up the rhetoric and threaten this kind of retaliation. And also, the other thing is mobilisation, right? People there on the ground in Kherson, Zaporizhia, are increasingly being pushed to take Russian passports, and as such could be then subject to mobilisation as Russian soldiers. We've definitely seen Russia trying to get as many troops as possible from Donetsk and Luhansk, where they've been in charge since 2014. So there's a real sense there that people who haven't been able to get out so far and have very few options to get out safely could soon be forced to fight against their own country, to fight against Ukraine.
Thanks for that, Nick. Nick Connolly in Kiev. Let's bring in Jade McGlynn. She's a senior researcher at the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies. Welcome to DW. Vladimir Putin's call-up and the reaction to it does seem to have intensified discussion and dissent about this war in a country where penalties for dissent are severe.
That's true. I do think that it's important to draw a distinction between dissent against having to fight in the war and dissent against the war in itself, because many of the Kremlin's narratives about the war and about the need to fight in what they call Nazis in Kiev, and that this is a war to liberate Ukraine from or wrest them from Anglo-Saxon control, they really do resonate with a lot of the Russian public. Right. But of course, it's one thing to nod your head on the television, and it's quite another thing to go and die in that war.
Right. And public anger, as we saw in that report, has appeared to be particularly strong in poorer ethnic minority regions of Russia, like Dagestan. Why is that likely to be?
That's true, and that's because the death rates in those areas, in the minority areas and also in the poorer regions, are considerably higher. So and of course these are just the official numbers, so it's likely that the death toll is much higher. If we're talking about official death tolls that are admitted of being in the late sort of 200s in regions such as the Buddhist Republic of Buryatia and the Muslim Republic of or Muslim majority republic, of enclave of Dagestan, then compared to Moscow, which has, many times more people, compared to, say, 290 deaths, there's 17 deaths. And these are only the official numbers.
But why would the absolute and proportionate number of deaths in this war be so much greater in these ethnic minority regions? Why is that?
Because one thing is that the Kremlin is rather scared of Muscovites' ability to protest. Right. So in general, they've done everything to make it feel as if in the so-called two capitals, Petersburg and Moscow, as if the war was very, very far away indeed. But also because the army so far, before it came to mobilization, the army was trying to lure recruits. So by offering them, up to 7, 8, 9 times the local salary. To sign a contract. And of course, that's much easier to do in poorer regions.
Understood. So as well as the riots and the men fleeing the country, some quite senior voices have been raised over this weekend, sort of tentative criticisms of these mobilisation orders. They include the editor of the state-run RT news channel and the chairs of the country's upper and lower houses of parliament. Are we looking at wobbles within the Russian establishment, with perhaps some damage being caused to President Putin's prestige there?
It's interesting. I think I'm always very reluctant to suggest that this will come as a direct challenge to Putin. Often any criticism is done through the sort of mechanism of, the bad boyars, and if only the Tsar knew, because, of course, the nature of the Russian regime is such that it's not advisable, to put it mildly, to criticize Putin directly. I think it reminds me a little bit of when Stalin rushed too quickly with collectivization and then realized that he'd created, a huge issue and that he wasn't going to be able to force it through will alone. And he wrote an article entitled Dizzy with Success. And essentially he blamed the way that collectivization was managed and sort of blamed it on the apparatchiks. And I do wonder if I'm getting similar. That there's many similarities.
The criticism, not of the war itself, but the way it's being executed by the people who are carrying out the commander's orders. It's been.
Exactly.
Can we turn to the hastily arranged referendums on annexation in those Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine? The thinking is that if those areas are declared to be part of Russia, then Putin can more easily deploy conscripted soldiers there. That's one of the theories that I've held. Does that theory hold water for you?
Not really, in the sense that, firstly, he's not deploying conscripted soldiers, but if we talk about mobilized soldiers, he can deploy them there quite easily. There are quite a few different theories. I think one aspect that's certainly been overlooked is that, this war in Ukraine, it's also about resources and about people as resources, somewhat ironically, given how many people are currently trying to flee Russia. But of course, we've seen this in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. He will try to mobilize and to recruit or at least to press gang into the army those Ukrainians who are living on territories that will very soon be claimed as Russian, obviously completely artificially and without any legal basis. So I think that's one aspect, is that actually he will then view those citizens as Russians that he can conscript that he can recruit into the army.
Thank you so much for joining us and outlining that so clearly. Jade McGlynn from the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies. Thank you.